Thank you very much. This is my first trip to Puerto Rico, and I'm enjoying it very much. It's beautiful. Everyone keeps telling me that it's raining, but I saw the sun this morning. It was lovely. So thank you. And I also promise you that Dr. Shelley and I have talked, and we don't sing. So we'll have to think of something creative, but it will not be singing. One of the things I would like to bring to you this morning when we talk about assessment, one of the most important things is that we use assessment as a way of having data to back up our strategic plan, to start strategic planning, to go forward with strategic planning, and to give it a basis. And one of the reasons that it's so important to do that is because lots of times when we are trying to acquire funds for our organizations, it's very important that we be able to tell our story. And the use of assessment data is one of the ways in which we can tell that story. And very often, we remember to report information, but we don't always remember that not everyone shares our view, and that we need to put this in a way that helps them understand the story that we are trying to tell. So what I'd like to do this morning is to show you a couple of examples of how we're using data to tell an organization's story at Rutgers, in the hope that that will be helpful to you. When I'm talking about assessment, what we do in the center where I work is we look at organizational assessment. So not just the assessment of learning, but the assessment of the organization and how it functions together. And we look at that by collecting and evaluating information about certain areas in the institution that are associated with organizational excellence. There are many studies out there that will tell us that if we are good in certain areas, that our institution will work well. So we look at those areas and we look at measuring progress towards our university mission, towards our goals, how can we use this information to improve our operations, and again, how do we tell our story? There are many different challenges facing higher education, and I'm sure that the challenges that you face are no different than the ones that we are facing at Rutgers. I'm hoping to also learn from you this week because Rutgers is about to get a medical school, which we have not had, so this is a new experience for us. But when we talk about assessment, out of these challenges, I think that there are 4 that are very important and that assessment is related to. And the first is responding meaningfully to external critiques. Responding to the things that people say, criticisms or suggestions for improvement that they may have for our programs or our colleges or our universities. This gives us a method in which we can respond. It's also very helpful in trying to create a shared purpose and a direction to unite faculty and staff. Very often that's a difficult bridge to make, to connect faculty and staff and to try to make sure that they share the same goals and that they understand that they are working for the same mission and the same groups of people. Many times we speak different languages, not English and Spanish, but faculty and administrative. We have different ways of talking about things, and assessment helps us bridge that. It also helps us respond proactively to accountability and performance management pressure. And those pressures are coming from many different areas. It can be from our students, it can be from parents of our students, it can be from people who fund us, it can be from accrediting organizations. So there are a lot of different people who are saying, where are your measures? Show me what you have and show me what you can demonstrate of what you've done. And one of the other benefits of organizational assessment is that it creates a culture of assessment. It sets us up to continue to assess the organization every year, to use that information for planning, and then to use it for improvement. So it helps us meet some of the challenges that we are facing. A little bit of history about assessment. It used to be for colleges and universities that we were assessed on some very basic things. They were based on the benefits that we provide to students and that we provide to the community. And those things were things like the reputation of the university, what resources we had available to us. It could be the size of our libraries. It could be the facilities that we have, what kind of buildings are available. It's the quality. It was based on the quality of the inputs, the quality of the students who were coming into our systems, and what opportunities we offered to them. But that's not where assessment is right now. Assessment is moving towards what benefits are people getting from us? What benefits do they derive from being part of our university, from attending, from participating, from learning with us? So if we look at all those things that were important before, the facilities and the resources and the opportunities, now we want to know what results are we getting, what are the outcomes that we have, and maybe most important of all, what kind of impact are we having on the students that we serve? Let me ask, how many of you have heard of the Malcolm Baldrige Award? Okay, a couple. The Malcolm Baldrige Award is an award that was started in 1987. It was named after the Secretary of Commerce, Malcolm Baldrige, and it was developed because there was some concern that businesses in the United States were losing their competitive edge, that they were no longer as competitive as they might be. And it was done to try to stimulate excellence. And one of the things that the Baldrige Award did when they were forming this is to research many, many different organizations. And they looked for the organizations who were the very best at what they did. And after interviewing and talking to all these different organizations, they came up with 7 criteria, 7 areas that they felt were necessary in order to be successful and to be excellent at what you did. What we've done at Rutgers, Dr. Brett Rubin, who is the director of our center, has taken the Baldrige information and basically translated it into the language of higher education. And what we use is called excellence in higher education. And again, it uses language which is much more familiar to those of us who are in the academic world. It has examples that we're more comfortable with, and it basically says what things are most important. How can we apply this idea of excellence, and how can we make it part of what we do in higher education? So what EHE, for short, what it does is it defines what excellence means. It gives us a standard of excellence. And it gives us a way, a strategy for looking at those standards. And it relies on assessment. It's an assessment model. It leads the way into planning and improvement. And it also helps people identify what their critical priorities are. It also inventories and organizes and integrates what things you are already doing. So it gives you a way to capture what you have going on. And we use the EHE, I will talk a little bit more about this in the workshop. We use it in a workshop format, and it becomes the guide for that. Let me talk a little bit about how it works. Well, start by saying there's a lot of similarity between what happens with the Baldrige and EHE, as I've explained, but there's also a link to accreditation. Rutgers is accredited by Middle States. I understand that that's also the organization that you're accredited. Dr. Rubin has worked closely with them, and some of the EHE criteria or processes have influenced, hopefully we like to think, have influenced some of the changes that have been made in Middle States over recent years. So what things do they have in common? How could EHE possibly be helpful to you in preparing for accreditation and also as part of your assessment process? Well, they both define excellence, a broad definition of excellence. They talk about and emphasize leadership and planning. They rely on clear and measurable goals, a focus on faculty, staff, students, and external constituents, a way to systematically assess the entire institution, keeping in mind that we can assess individual programs, departments, and the whole university. It helps us compare ourselves with peers, with other institutions that are also doing assessment, or those who are doing the same types of things that we're doing. It looks at the outcomes, and it relies on this cycle of review, planning, and continuous improvement, which recognizes, as you know, based on the programs, based on what we just learned about the things that you've been doing over the past few years, assessment relies on a repetitive cycle, on doing it every year and using that information to help you improve. Some of the principles that are important in EHE: a clear and shared sense of purpose and mission. It looks at your leadership and governance processes. Again, a lead into strategic planning and excellence. strong relationship with our constituents, especially those who benefit from our goods and services that we provide, dedicated faculty and staff, a review process, assessment of outcomes, and gathering and sharing information. So what does this framework look like that can be used? If you look at the model, these are the dimensions of institutional effectiveness. These are the things that have been recognized as the areas in which an institution must excel in order to be recognized as excellent. And there are 7 categories: leadership, purposes and plans, which is basically strategic planning and how you conduct strategic planning, beneficiaries and constituents, those people who benefit from your services, programs and services, your faculty, staff, and the quality of your workplace, assessment and information use, what information you have and how do you use it, and what outcomes and achievements. And outcomes and achievements is very important in this because this is where you'll find a lot of your data. This is the category that says, we've said we do well in all of these things, but how can we demonstrate it? What data do we have to support it that shows us that we actually are doing a good job and that we're making progress? So this is the framework, and we ask people to evaluate themselves in all of these categories. This type of framework can be used at any level of the institution. You have so many different areas participating in Title V and in your projects that you have. You can apply assessment at many levels. You can apply it at a campus level. You can look at it for individual divisions or departments, and you can look at it for programs or services. Much like you talked about pilots, one of the things that we found is it's often much better to let a small unit try this and try assessment and build the focus from there. We've learned that if we tell people they have to assess things, they don't like it. They don't like to do that. They don't like to be told what to do. But if we invite them to participate and we can show them that other schools, other chairs, other deans have become involved in this, that helps support it and it makes it more likely that it will be used. So what is the process? We look at bringing assessment full circle. We start out by assessing the organization, by prioritizing what your areas for improvement are. One of the most important things about assessment is you will learn much about your organization, so I'm sure you already do with the systems that you have, but you cannot do everything, and you cannot fix everything at once. So we need to talk about how you prioritize. Planning improvement projects, what things will you take on? Implementing them, completing them and reporting back on your progress, and then starting again with the new assessment. So it's, again, that cyclical thing. So when we talk about assessment, we talk about assessment of an organization, what are some of the things that we need? What kinds of things are we talking about? Well, the most important thing is to look at what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to learn by assessment? What is it you want to do, and what is it you want to use the information for? Again, one of the things that we very often recommend to different areas is that they use an assessment process before they conduct strategic planning. That they go in and really take a look at the organization to understand it and to know what they're doing well, to know where their strengths are and what they'd like to improve before they engage in a strategic planning process. The next question, and this relates to the beneficiaries and constituents, is what's important to the people who are important to us? Okay? We know that there are other people who are involved in our success and what happens to us, and that can be anywhere from our students, from our alumni, it can be the people, the faculty and staff who are working here, it can also be government, accrediting organizations, it could be the media. Rutgers has received a lot of media attention this year, not all of it welcome, and so we know how important that can be. If you think about it, we have many people who are important to us and important to our success, but it's not always something that we think about. It's not always something we define. Sometimes we limit ourselves to certain groups. What are the important vital signs of our organizational fitness? What are the things that tell you that you're doing a good job? What are the things telling you that you're succeeding? And how do we judge that success? And then the data piece. How do we know? How effective are we? Are we making progress towards our vision and goals? And how are we using this knowledge to try to improve what we do? When we talk about assessment, I think one of the clearest things that we need to do is have a good understanding of what our goals are. If you know what your goals are as a program or a university, and here we're saying looking at your goals in terms of the 7 categories that we've spelled out for organizational excellence, what do you do with those goals? How do you translate them into measures that make sense and that can be useful to you? So if we think about the measures that we want to use, we have many different measures that we are required to look at. We have many different things we're required to report. We have different things like graduation rates and things that we are used to using as measures. But as an organization, we may want to look a little more broadly at what we're measuring. So if we think of organizational measures as broad indicators of organizational performance, they can become they're the criteria that we use to track how we're improving and a way to compare our outcomes and achievements. And that way they become a tool, they become something that we use. So when you're deciding what things you would like to measure, what things you want to measure, it's very important that they reflect the strategic priorities that you have and what things you've decided are important to your performance. There are so many things that we collect data on. Let me ask it this way. Are there things, I'm going to suggest that are there things that you collect data on that you only collect because someone requires it? Yeah, okay. Things that you would choose not to collect data on if you didn't have to. Things that may not be clues or may not be indicators of your success. We all have them. We all have things that we have to report. Trust me, I worked for government for 28 years, and I know what we ask people to report, many different things. So make sure that the things that you're setting up as your organizational measures are things that are strategic, things that are important to you. Even if someone is not asking for them, what's important to you? Is it data that's likely to lead to improvement? Many times we count things. We count things because we need to, or because it's easy to do. So how can we get data that we think will actually help us improve? What are our stakeholder needs? What do they want? And one of the important questions is, how do we know what they want? Have we ever talked to students to find out what they think of our programs? Have we talked to outside groups that provide our funding to see what they think? Your measures also have to be easily understood by a broad audience. They need to be translatable into things that are important for a non-academic audience. They let you compare with other institutions, and maybe most important, they balance the cost of obtaining data with the value of having it. If you're looking at a measure and it's too difficult or too expensive to capture, the chances are you're not going to do it well necessarily, or that it's not going to provide enough value to you. So you need to look at, is it so difficult to collect that it's not worth the effort that I'm putting in? What things could I be looking at that would be equally useful to me? When we work with different organizations to try to figure out what types of things they should be asking and how they should assess themselves, one of the most important questions that you can ask yourself is very simply, why? We had a program at Rutgers, I work mostly with undergraduates, but in the undergraduate programs designed to help transfer students, people who are coming into Rutgers at some point during their career. And I met with these people who are very dedicated, and they put a lot of effort into making sure that these students are happy and that they're integrated and they fit into the university. And I said to them, this is great, we can develop some measures for you, but why do you do what you do? I said, because we help transfer students. I said, what would happen if you didn't help the transfer students? Well, they might not be successful. Well, how do you define whether they're successful? If they stay and they finish and they complete their degree. Well, there's your measure. So one of the things that we do is we tend to think just in terms of our goals, but we don't translate them into what kind of things can we measure. And by asking yourself why you do something, often enough, if you keep asking long enough, you'll get to your measure and you'll figure out what's important to you. And it may not be the things that you're collecting now. So how do we go from an assessment process to using what we learn in an assessment to try to create change or to improve? Well, when you go through an assessment process, whether it's Baldrige or whether it's EHE or whether it's any other assessment process that's out there, generally you come up with three things. You come out with a list of what you do well, the strengths of your program or your school or your university. So you identify which things you're doing well in each of those categories. You identify what your opportunities for improvement are. What are the things that you want to do better? What are the things that you think are important to improve? And what are your measures? And what does the data tell you about your measures, whether you're doing well or whether you need to improve them? So we've got these three pieces of information that we want to be able to use. A lot of what happens in telling your organizational assessment story to people is being able to get it to them in a form that they can understand. And again, we know what we're looking at, but we're providing information for a lot of outside audiences who may not understand the importance of the different things that we do at a university. So one of the easiest ways that you can display data is by the use of a dashboard. Does anyone have an organizational dashboard on their website? Okay. Dashboards are a great tool as long as they can be easily understood. This is just a snapshot of one. This is for the Upward Bound program, which helps students be successful. It's a pre-college program that will help them be successful when they arrive, hopefully. And when we started talking to them about what their assessment measures were and how they were determining success, they were measuring average SAT scores, average test scores, and looking at the students to see how well they did. Well, we suggested that instead of looking at the students in the program, that they look at all students in New Jersey and make a comparison there, and then also compare to the school districts that the children were coming from, that the students were coming from. And when they did that, they found that the students who had gone through the Upward Bound program were much more successful than the students in the district from which they had come. And they hadn't really looked at it that way before. So how could they use this information to tell their story? Well, they went out, now they had new data, they had new information, they had different comparisons that they could use. So they put this on their data, they created a dashboard, put that out there. They shared that with school districts, they shared that with accreditors, they shared that with the public, they shared it with their students and the parents of their students, because that gave them a different way to say, here's why you should participate in this program. Here's why it's a good thing. It also helped the program because we said to them, why do you do this program? What is it that you get out of it? What's the benefit? What's the benefit to Rutgers? And we actually ended up finding out that a large number of the students who go through Upward Bound don't go to Rutgers. They end up going to other colleges and universities across the country. So we said to them, you need to decide whether you want these students to be successful or whether you want them to be successful at Rutgers, which one is more important to you. And they said both. We want them to be successful no matter where they go, but we'd really like them to come here. So we started looking at both of those things as a way to measure and say, what can we do to encourage them, to have them come here and to stick with us through the program? So again, an example of the dashboard that is based on a set of measures that they might not have thought of before that. Back to why, to asking why. And what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on during this presentation is to talk to you about a very kind of broad, university-wide way of looking at and telling our story. And it's called MAP. We call it MAP, like a road map. But it's the Mission Assessment, Alignment, and Planning Program. And although this information that I'm going to share with you today is based on what we do for undergraduates, they're developing a graduate version now, so I expect that we'll be looking at the same type of information. And the question became, again, how do we tell people what kind of job we're doing? How do we share with them how well we're accomplishing our goals, how well we're meeting our goals? And we found out that it's not only important to share it outside the university, but also inside, that not everyone inside was looking at the mission of the university in the same way. People were very much concerned with just the area that they use, with what they do and what's important to them. We said, But the mission of the university is much broader. It's to serve students at all levels. It's from the day that they come to us originally till the day that they leave. And how do we get people to look at the undergraduate experience and see how they fit into that picture? We started with the undergraduate experience, and Rutgers defines its mission in 3 parts. There's a research mission, an instructional or teaching mission, and a service mission. There'll be a 4th added on July 1st with patient care when we have the medical school, so it'll be 4 parts then. So why did we start with undergraduates? Well, it's what the public thinks we do. That's what they associate with our university. It's what the public is holding us accountable for and the people who are funding us. And because we think we have a great story to tell. So how do we do that in a way that people could understand? First, we started out deciding what are the goals for the university. It doesn't like me. I'm not a technology person. What are the goals for the university in terms of the undergraduate experience? And again, this can be easily translated to a graduate experience. Okay? So what are they? Well, student recruitment. These are the categories that we came up with. Student recruitment, how they get here. Rutgers support and pride, how they feel about the university. Their personal and professional development during the time that they're here. The academic degree goals, what things are they doing in order to, within each program, like a core curriculum, like certain subjects that they have to cover. What's their progress to degree? Okay? Not just retention, but are they making progress? Their post-graduation success, and how do we support faculty and staff? So those are some of the things that we are looking at. And there are a lot of subcategories, as you can imagine, under that. So what did we do with this information? First, we said, for each program, for each unit that wants to do an assessment, it really doesn't like me. For each program that wants to be part of this, let's make them define their goals. What's important to them? And do you have goals that are set up for your programs? Do you have goals within each of your programs? Okay, great place to start. So we look at whether they align, those goals that we have, whether they align with the goals of the entire university. Do they fit? Because if they don't fit, we have some things to think about. So we broke it down into the various types of programs. And again, as I said before, you can use this at any level. And we made a picture. We wanted something that would be visual, that would catch people's attention, and math is a visual tool that can be used. Okay? I'm doing something that makes it do it automatically. Okay? So what we've said is for each unit, if you look across the top, the 7 or 8 goals that I just went through, that I just read to you, are across the top, and each one has a color assigned to it. For each program that wants to participate in this, and this one we use the School of Arts and Sciences honors programs, just as an example. For each program that wants to be part of this, we said, list all the things that you do along the left side of the page. Let's look at all your different programs. What are the major things that you provide? So in this case, these are some of the things that they listed. That they have recruitment and scholars days, that they have scholarships, they have summer reading, they have a faculty mentor program, a peer mentor program, tutoring project, honors colloquium, and a heavy research component. We said, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of what the goals are for the university? What we said to them was, for each of your programs, I'm sorry, I'm figuring that someone has a timer set on this and it's my fault, so I'll apologize. What we said to them was, for each one of these programs that you offer, color in the box where it most easily applies, where it's most appropriate. What does it apply to? So recruitment and scholars days are very important to student recruitment. Okay? Academic planning and advising, which is here, shows up in many categories. It impacts Rutgers support and pride. It also impacts learning, and it impacts progress to degree. So for each one of these, you we said this to people, was they all wanted to be in every column. They said, we do everything for everyone, and we have a part of everything that goes on here. Not really. We need you to think about what are the things that are most important. So as they color this in and they look at it, they start realizing what their contributions are. And once we have this matrix available, then we can go to assessment, because now we've defined where the goals are. So we said, what evidence is there that the unit's meeting the goals that it's set? What measures do we have? Well, now we not only have data, but we have a context to put it in. We can look at it and say, well, which things is it important to? How can we provide links? So the way this has been set up, this is, I apologize. When we take a look at this, one of the things that we said was a goal was increase the number of undergraduates who can compete for distinguished fellowships. This is the goal of one of the SAS honors programs. So what would happen is, you would look at where that is, down here, postgraduate programs, and if you go to that box and you click on it, it links to their data. Data that they retain, that they control, that they may have on their website, data that they already collect, data and information that's available to them. And we said, this is the Office of Distinguished Fellowships and Postgraduate Guidance. This is their dashboard. It already exists, but what we've done is provide a link. And by linking those two things, now we've taken information that may already exist, but it didn't have a context before. It didn't have a link to show what part of the story it was trying to tell. It didn't have a way to say, this is where this fits in the whole scheme of things. So the next step was to look at planning. Now that we have this information, how are these assessment results used to try to improve how they're achieving the goal? So what does it tell us about how each unit is doing individually? What does it tell us about how that information combines to tell us how the university's doing? And this is maybe the one that I want to focus on the most. What synergies can be cultivated between units that all contribute to a particular mission goal? What can we do to make them see how they're linked together and how those links are going to be very important in terms of the success of our programs? So if you think about this, we've looked, what I've done before is to ask you to look across and see what programs what categories, which goals each one is meeting. Now what we're going to do is look up and down. So we said for each goal, and this one is the one about progress to degree, is what things, the subtitles or the subcategories that are important to us are retention and academic success, timely graduation rates, 4- and 6-year graduation rates. So when you have this map, we looked at it and we said, well, what are all the programs vertically that contribute to that? How do we bring them together? Because they don't talk to each other. They don't work together. They don't share data necessarily with each other. They don't realize they're working toward the same goal, because normally it's not the way that we look at programs. So when we started looking at this, we said, let's see who contributes to this and who has data that might be helpful. Well, new student orientation has a piece of that. Academic advising does. The Office of Undergraduate Education's first-year programs, student affairs and student life, the learning communities, libraries, general education, the academic disciplines, the majors and the minors, they all had something to contribute here. So by looking at this vertically, what we said is, here's a chance to create synergies. Here's a chance to say, we want all of these groups to work together because you share some common goals and you have data and information that might be useful to each other. One other example, and the one that I found kind of interesting, was when we were going through this, we were meeting with people from information technology, and we were trying to help them set up some measures and trying to help them see where they fell in terms of this map and how they could set up what they were doing. So we started talking about different things that they're involved with. and what categories they might be in. And we went through some of the easy ones and talked to them about it. And they said, well, we need to have a box in student recruitment. Why? Yeah, back to my favorite question, why? Why do you need to have a box? Why do you think information technology should be in the goal of student recruitment? And they said because students are making the decisions about whether to come here based on whether our dorms have wireless access or not. Okay? No one had really thought about that way. But yet it's become a very competitive environment, and that's one of the things that students are looking for. I know in my classroom, the first thing that happens is when they rush into class, everyone tries to sit next to the electric outlet so that they can plug in their laptop. And there's only 2 outlets in the room. So I know how important that is to them. So as we took that to another level and got into the discussion, they said, you know what, we need to be part of Rutgers Support and Pride because there's a facilities component. And you know what happens? Those facilities people, because that's how we talk about other units, those facility people never ask us what we need. They just built a brand new auditorium that has no electric outlets that are accessible by students. So they said if they had asked us, we would have told them that that's important. It's important to their success because they're taking notes on their laptops, because they want to be able to look up other resources. So as we worked this through with the information technology people, we started to see that there were some connections that needed to be made, that we needed to take the facilities people and many others and say, when we're designing our programs, you need to talk to these people over here. So that's what we mean by creating synergies, is finding out who's working toward the same goals and having them work with each other so that we can come up with an improvement to student recruitment that wouldn't have been there if they had each kept looking just at their own data. So it's not only important to have data and have a way to display it, but also to be able to share that information. And by making this more public, by putting it on a website, it gave access to everyone on campus. So if they wanted to look at your data, they could. And that was something that we thought was very important, that it be a very transparent process, that people could go out and they could see what information was out there. So what are the things that we tried to accomplish through this? Again, we wanted a visual display of the way each unit's goals align with the university goals. We wanted them to know, we keep saying, we want everyone to know where their seat is in the family portrait. And we want everyone to look at it and realize what their contribution is. And one of the questions we often get asked is, what happens if I don't fit under one of those 8 categories? And the response was, then you need to look at why you're providing that service. So it becomes a way to help us to prioritize what we're doing and to help us look at what we should be spending our efforts and our money and our energy on. It gives a collective portal to the assessment data. Instead of assessment data being information that's in a box or on a shelf or in a file drawer somewhere, it puts it in front of people, makes it available to a broader audience. It helps facilitate planning because you can see quickly by looking at the data that's out there or the boxes and the links what goals are not being met. And again, it cultivates synergies, which we think is probably the most important thing that it does. If we go back to the things that I said at the outset of this presentation, when we talked about telling your story, it provides a way to communicate with stakeholders and with the university community. It helps promote cooperation within the units, among the units. It helps people see how they fit into goals. The data being available helps us write a very compelling story about what we're doing, about what we're accomplishing. And that can be used, we've used it with middle states, we've used it with the public, we've used it in student recruitment material, we've used it to go out and say, here's what we now know about how well we're doing as a university. It also gives you context. When we look at things, and I'm sure you have things that are parallel At the undergraduate level, we're looking at admissions profiles and retention statistics and graduation rates and all those things that people love to report in the paper and in the media, and they love to tell people about, and they look at the rankings. Well, it gives us a context to say, this is what these numbers mean. In the real world of how we serve students, this is what these numbers tell us. This is what's important. Math is a tool, and I wouldn't stand here and suggest that it's the only tool that's available to you. But the things that I hope you can take away from it is that sometimes it's very helpful to people. We all learn in different ways. Sometimes having a visual reminder or a visual system is very important. It makes it easy. Giving people access to information is important. So math is only one tool, and however you choose to do it, if you're participating in assessment, you're getting things done, there are some definite benefits that you're going to accrue. First of all, assessment as a whole, if you look at assessing your organization, it makes you focus on what your mission is. It makes you really think about whether you're fulfilling that mission. What are your priorities? What is it that's most important? It gives the people who work on it and who work for you and with you a sense of what your most important programs and services are. One of the key things it does is it gives you shared perspective. When we do assessment, again, we do them as workshop models, it brings people together so that they hear the same information. And some of the research that we've shown tells us that when people hear that same information about the strengths and the opportunities for improvement, it tends to change the way that they look at the organization. It gives them a much better understanding of the mission. It makes them think about what's important to them. It gives us our strengths and our opportunities for improvement. It gives us ways to compare against ourselves, against our peer organizations. And it makes people feel personally responsible. If they understand what's important and what you're assessing, they're more willing to be engaged in that. Helps us monitor our progress, and perhaps more importantly for the subject of strategic planning, it gives you a starting point so that you know what you've started with and what you're doing. So the challenge that I would suggest to you is that we all do assessment in some way. We all have some data we collect, we all have information, we all have things that are required of us, we have things that we need to do. But the challenge that we have is how can we take what we're doing now and how can we expand it? How can we make sure that the things that we're assessing are about our performance and our results? How can we be sure we're looking at outcomes and impacts as opposed to counting things or looking at things that are required of us? And then how do we take that information and how do we link that to planning and improvement? And if you can do that and you can build that cycle, an organizational assessment becomes a very important tool for you to use. I'd be very happy to take any questions that you might have. Question to answer because there is no obvious cost. When we look at how we do assessment, one of the things, let me tell you a little bit about the structure and that may be helpful. The center in which I work provides, we're one of the small centers, and the best way I can describe us is that we're consultants to the rest of the university. And we provide our services free of charge to anyone in the university. So an organization will call us and say, we're interested in doing assessment. We work with a lot of department chairs and a lot of deans, especially people who have just come in and taken over programs. So what we do is we'll meet with them, we'll help them do pre-surveys of the people who work for them to find out what's important. We run workshops, we give them follow-up. So on its face, there's no cost. When you look at something like math that we put together, this was all done internally, so the cost is time and cost is energy. But there's not an actual dollar cost. If you use a model like Baldrige or EHE, it can be done with no cost to you or to your program if you follow the guidelines and you look at those things. You're basically saying someone has told us or someone has defined for us what are the categories that represent organizational excellence. So how can we look at ourselves and decide whether or not we're meeting the challenge in those areas. So it doesn't have to be an expensive proposition. It can be something that can be scaled, that you can do on a very small scale or a very broad scale. So that, I hope that answers your question. When you talk about whether that data is being used more broadly, whether it's being used more widely now, one of the things that's important to do is when you do assessment, we can each go back and assess our own programs. But by doing it in a very visual way, by doing it in a way that people are involved in and that they see, it creates that idea of a culture of assessment. So I think what I've seen happen now is we've always had some institutional data, we've always had some things we collect, but now the categories are very different and we're looking at things that cut across programs. So I think now that people have started doing assessments, and some units are very involved in it, and they've done them for several years, people know to ask for the data. They'll say, what evidence do you have? And that's really what it comes down to. If you're telling me you do an excellent job in terms of your programs and services, what data do you have that you can show me? One of the most important things about the Baldrige Award and the Baldrige criteria, which EHE is based on, is that it says to people, how can you demonstrate? It has questions, and you can say, this is what excellent organizations look like. These are some of the best practices. Are you doing those things? And how widely in your organization? Is one small piece doing it? Is everyone in the organization doing it? So you create that idea that information should be available and that you have it and that you can ask for it. So I think that's what it does. It creates that sense that it's there and that it's important to use. So I would say yes. Barrier that we found in trying to do organizational assessment has to do with the academic culture, and that people don't like being told what to do. We have academic freedom and we like to make our decisions. And one of the things that I learned very quickly when I went to Rutgers is that the surest way of having a program fail is to tell someone they have to do it. So what we have done is use a strategy that says we're going to let our programs grow organically. We're going to say, let's talk to a chair or a dean who we know may be very progressive, who's very willing to do these kinds of things, or who's willing to try new things, who really openly values the excellence of their program and wants a way to talk about that. And we'll work with that dean and we'll really encourage them then to tell others. So a lot of the way that we grow these programs is by getting people who are interested to come to us rather than us telling them that they need to participate. I think that's probably the single biggest barrier that we found. The other thing that has become a barrier is, again in the workshop I can talk more about sort of the method that we use, but you end up at the end of the day with a set of priorities, a set of projects and things that you want to do. And that's great until everyone goes back to their real job the next day. And sometimes real life gets in the way of being able to accomplish the things we want to do. Because we believe in assessment, we assess our own programs. We do 6-month and 12-month follow-ups on the services we provide. And we just finished a study on our strategic planning services. And that was the one thing that came up was, when I got back to my department, it was difficult to find time to do the things that I know I have to do because of your program. So I think that if we look at this as not a one-time thing, but as an ongoing idea of doing assessment and continually looking at how well we're doing and evaluating it, it's much more helpful than people thinking, now I've got to go do 5 things because I was part of this. It's do what you can to improve, keep improving, that idea that you always want to be getting better. And I think those are probably the things that are most difficult to overcome, but can be overcome. Educating people and being transparent and getting them to know what your outcomes and your results are is critically important. There are a couple different ways that you can do that. One is by making assessment a responsibility of everybody in the unit, having everyone in the unit participate in a workshop, having everybody come together so they're hearing the same types of things from each other. The other thing you can do is to share your results. By putting these things out on the website and making them available, people were seeing data for their units that they had never seen before. So there's something about sharing that with everybody that becomes very important, because you're right, we tend to keep that information in certain places and at certain levels. So being able to make it available to everyone becomes very important. Let me tell you one brief story that I think helps show why it's important to bring people from all levels together. I did an organizational assessment one time of a program, and we went in and we talked to them, and we had a mix of people in the room. And this was a government organization, so we had some secretaries, we had some engineers, we had some managers, we had people at all different levels. And this program, in assessment, you're asking yourself questions about how well you're doing, and how you know it, and whether you know it. So we got talking about their beneficiaries, the people who benefit from their services. And we said, well, do you measure, do you have a way of knowing whether they think you're doing a good job or not? And one of the engineers raised his hand and he said, absolutely. He says, they think we're doing a great job. And I said, how do you know? He said, because we don't get any complaints. And the secretary started to laugh. She couldn't help it. She said, I'm the one who opens all the letters. I'm the one who knows how many complaints there are, and I'm the one who knows what they're complaining about. Turns out she took the letters and she filed them. So what we said was, okay, one of your opportunities for improvement is to come up with a process that lets that information go to the people on the projects who need it, so that we can make sure we're making our beneficiaries happy. And that was one of their outcomes that they decided to change. So you're right, if you don't share information with people at all different levels, you miss out on a chance to get very valuable information. The other thing that you can do is, let's say you have a very large unit. We worked with a group that was over 100 people. We said, well, we can't put everyone in a room, but we're going to take all the opportunities for improvement and we're going to put them in an electronic survey, and we're going to send them out to people. And we're going to say, fill out the survey, tell us what you think is most important. And you often find out that priorities are very, very different when you ask everyone in the unit as compared to just the leaders. So there's different ways to engage people and different ways to involve them and to educate them about what you're doing, but you have to be very aware of it. You have to make a conscious decision to do that. Okay, thank you very much.
Bien, agradecemos a la doctora Anual su participación y para continuar con la segunda sesión plenaria de este simposio, pues pasa con nosotros ahora la doctora Carmen Colón para presentar al invitado por estos días.
Buenos días. Me place presentar al doctor Randy Swing. El doctor Randy Swing obtuvo su bachillerato en artes con concentración en psicología de la Universidad de Carolina del Norte y una maestría en artes de la Appalachian State University. Él es también egresado de la Universidad de Georgia, donde obtuvo un grado de doctor en filosofía en educación superior. Ha ocupado una gran variedad de posiciones académico-administrativas en la Appalachian State University. Durante 20 años que sirvió a dicha institución. Una de sus contribuciones más importantes en esta institución fue el haber fundado y dirigido la iniciativa de evaluación institucional a nivel de todo el campus, que cuenta con alrededor de 17.000 estudiantes. El doctor Randy Swing también fungió 8 años como codirector e investigador experto del Policy Center on the First Year of College, actualmente conocido como Instituto John Gardner para la Excelencia en la Educación Subgraduada. Ambas organizaciones son ampliamente reconocidas por su gran contribución a la excelencia de la educación subgraduada a través del primer año universitario. Desde diciembre del 2007, el Dr. Swing ocupa la posición de director ejecutivo de la Asociación para Investigación Institucional, Association for Institutional Research, o AIR, por sus siglas en inglés, organización que tiene un amplio reconocimiento internacional en el área de investigación institucional. Esta organización tiene más de 4.000 miembros procedentes de más de 1.000 universidades. Randy Swing ha presentado en innumerables conferencias, simposios, talleres dentro y fuera de Estados Unidos. Los temas de sus presentaciones giran en torno a las áreas de primer año de estudio universitario, investigación institucional y avalúo en la educación superior. También ha colaborado en proyectos de investigación institucional en Japón, recibiendo un nombramiento honorario como catedrático asociado visitante de la Universidad Kansai de Estudios Internacionales en Japón. Asimismo, es consultor para la Agencia de Garantía de Calidad de Escocia. El Dr. Swing también es miembro de juntas y comisiones como el Instituto Nacional para el Avalúo de Logros del Aprendizaje, la Fundación de Educación Sureña y el Comité de Estudio de Validación del United Negro College Fund. Ha publicado artículos y libros, entre los que se incluyen Higher Education Assessment Leadership Matters en el 2010, Achieving and Sustaining Excellence in the First College Year en el 2006 y Proving and Improving Tools and Techniques for Assessing the First College Year en el 2004. Es un placer contar con la presencia del Dr. Swing en esta mañana.
Good morning. What a gracious welcome everyone has given me. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I thought I'd start with a little humor, I hope. Is this what your assessment program looks like? I saw this on a website, and obviously, can't you imagine that pretty soon somebody said, why come back down the ladder? Why not just drive to the next one while hanging up there, right? So I think many faculty think that this is the way assessment works, that it's a pretty messy operation and it's been hobbled together in lots of ways. And so what I'd like to do is to try to show that maybe there is more logic and there's more structure, and that it's okay if it's a little messy. All right? So I kind of like this. I could have built that myself. Like that. So, well, let me warn you, that working with assessment will make your hair fall out. Now, I'm a data person, so I have beginning data. I've collected it throughout time, so I have a longitudinal study to show that this is true. So now I've given you warning. Are you willing to stay? Because this could happen to you. I see some of you I didn't warn fast enough. So, well, let me just continue on with this mode because I hope that you'll get the sense before I'm done that I'm really passionate about higher education. I'm really serious about the whole idea of assessment, but I also understand that I can't take this too seriously because as the previous speaker suggested, work on a campus can be a difficult thing because of the culture of independence that we all have, right? So I happen to know that many assessment officers receive less than warm welcomes when they show up in departments. In fact, I started working in assessment, I guess almost 30 years ago, when we had decided as higher educators that we even were going to do this stuff, right? So early on in my consulting career, I would be hired by college presidents to come and deliver the news to the faculty that because the organization was accredited, that they were in fact going to have an assessment program. The president and the provost were not willing to say this because the faculty would not like that. So they were willing to hire me to fly in, deliver the news, because I could fly out the next day, after having received the wrath of the faculty about why grades weren't good enough. So I've answered that question a lot. Anyway, I have to tell you, because I'm assuming you're staying here, because many of you are charged with some assessment effort. Is that right? How many of you think you have a job as an assessment person? Right, well, I have some footage. This may be shocking, and I apologize. It's an actual attack on an assessment officer. But I thought we'd just start with the realities here. Here it is, walking across. This is, all right, you've been there. Have you been there? Right. So I'm right here with you. I'm trying to set the stage that I'm one of you, okay? What I'd like to do in my hour here is to real quickly kind of go through 3 points. I'd like to do a primer about Assessment 101. And I'm doing this for smart people. In other words, I'm assuming that you are not new to this. I mean, you're accredited by middle stage. You couldn't have gotten that unless you already knew something about assessment. But a little bit of a primer to remind you about some of the things you may be taking for granted, right, after having worked in the field. And then I'm going to do what I call kind of rapid fire ideas. Another way you might think of it is the speaker can't decide which things to include, so he included everything in the pot at the end. But the point is, I want to suggest some different ways of thinking about assessment that might stir the pot for you. So rather than bringing solutions, what I hope I'm doing is bringing ideas that you will take and run with, right? That you'll create something totally different because they spur you to think about assessment. So let me be clear to begin with that I think there's a very simple definition of what successful assessment is, and that's that it creates action, right? That there are 2 different levels of this. One is that it can encourage you to continue effective practice. So I want to make the point really clearly from the beginning. There's nothing sadder to me than to have assessment aligned with finding out only what you're doing wrong and trying to fix it, right? Unfortunately, that's how many viewers think of assessment. And I'd like to suggest to you that if you had to choose, and I hope you don't, but if you had to choose between assessment that finds out what you're doing wrong and assessment that finds out what you're doing right, there's more value in finding out what you're doing well so you can protect that. Right? Don't change. Don't accidentally throw away something that is working well for you. It's a really different way of thinking about assessment if you're thinking that it's okay to document your success. And I'd encourage you to start there. Now, along the way, you're going to find that some things need to be improved, right? And so there's no harm in that. But again, it'll be perceived really differently if your changes are mixed in with your acknowledgement of what's working already. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. Have you already figured that out? And by now, you should be asking, why did they fly this guy in? Because we already knew this stuff. And I hope that that'll kind of continue along here. It's okay. So let me suggest then that there are two models of assessment that are to be resolved, or that you have to at least understand the tension between these two, and then allow for that. Okay. One is that improvement model, right? And you saw that before, of a cycle of improvement, right? That you do something, you move it forward, you reevaluate, right? It's the improvement cycle. Now, I'm a big fan of continuous improvement, and so I like this a great deal. The other way of thinking about assessment is that it's for transparency or accountability. Now, many of you will know the writing of George Koo, who's the executive director of the NILOA, the National Center on Learning Outcomes Assessment. George Koo has written that he sees these as two tracks, and that the job of higher education is to bend the rails to bring them together to a single track. Boy, that is so poetic. You know, I just love the visual imagery of bending the rails, right? So George and I get in rooms together and talk, and I'll tell you that I tell him that if you had only one rail, the train would keep tipping over, right? That this is not that poetic, that there are two rails. Let's just acknowledge that there's two separate tracks, and let's keep them in alignment, right? Isn't that another way of thinking about it? So transparency and accountability. Back when I worked on a college campus, that wasn't so important to me. Right? I mean, I was all about improvement, because I sat with students every day, and I wanted to see those students served better. Right? So that was my driver. Today, and for the last 8 years, I've spent most of my time now in and out of Washington, D.C. So I spend a lot of time with federal bureaucrats talking about higher education. They don't talk about improvement up there. They talk about transparency, right? And so I've had to learn that there is real value in transparency, right? And I'm now more conflicted about how I would do these two things if I had to balance them on a college campus. But at least I acknowledge they exist. Now, another kind of two-model approach that you have to get your arms around is that some assessments are individual in nature. And what that means is that you measure student A, you measure them going through some educational activity, and if the outcome falls below your expectation, you fix the student. Right? So this is all about changing the student because of the finding from the outcome. Program assessment starts with measurements of students, but it's several of them. They go through educational activities. And if you don't like the finding, you change the program, right? Not the student. Now, what I find is that campuses often think they're doing program assessment, But then once they find that the students weren't achieving at the right level, they try to fix the student. Right? They get confused. So I want you to understand, you got to start from at the very beginning. You have to decide which of these models you're doing, and here's why. You need very exact instruments and measurements if you're doing individual assessment. Right? You can't have the instruments have variance that is largely unexplained. For program assessment, it turns out your instruments can vary a little, and it's okay, because across the groups, they kind of shake out so that it's all right. So the level of instrument that you want to use should absolutely be selected based on whether you're doing individual or program evaluation. And don't get confused then later and try to reverse them. Now, in my speeches, I regularly use medical examples because they kind of are easy for audiences to understand. And I'm very much aware that I would be an idiot to use medical examples in front of you. Because you know more about medicine than I will ever know about medicine. So, but let me at least suggest that taking a patient's temperature might be something you would use in kind of explaining this. Is that if you want to know about a patient, then your thermometer better be really dead on accurate, right? But if you want to know of humans, kind of what is our average temperature, I suspect that a thermometer that varied a little bit wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Right? Do you get how that applies? Now I'll try to not keep doing that, or I'll get in trouble. I'm a big fan of value-added, or the IEO model. And of course you'll recognize this as the work of Sandy Aston, who came up with this way back in the 60s. It was published in the 90s and became something that people started to use. I use this model especially when I'm teaching administrators who do not have much of an understanding of assessment, as a way for them to look at a plan that comes from their assessment office to decide whether it's a good plan or poor plan or not. And so I suspect this is not news for you, but I want to suggest kind of a way that you could teach others about assessment by using the IEO model. I don't like it when assessment officers make the whole idea of assessment feel like it is really complicated and something that only specialists can understand. Right? Instead, I'd rather that we have a more simple model, one that we can explain to people. And since I'm a simpleton, I know I can remember 3 points. Right? If it were a 4-point model, I'd probably be in trouble. In fact, I have to tell the story real quickly that in graduate school, we would be assigned books to read that we would have to report to the class on, right? That kind of model. So I was assigned Sandy Aston's book when I was a doctoral student that introduces this model. And at that point, I had not a lot of interest in assessment, nor experience in it. So I sat in my apartment and I read this book. And in essence, what Sandy Aston said is, students arrive with certain stuff. They go through experiences that we could measure and monitor. And there are outcomes because of those 2 things. And a graduate student knows everything, right? So I sat there and I thought, this guy got famous thinking this up? And they published it? Is it worth putting it in a book? So I think when I reported this to my fellow students, I probably had a smirk on my face, as I reported this whole simple idea. And then I graduated with my doctorate, and I went back to Appalachian State University, and I became the director of assessment. And I was sitting in my office the first day as director of assessment, and I had some challenges, And I thought, how am I going to deal with this? And then I started thinking, well, gosh, I've got to know where students came in. I got to know what they did. And I've got to know what we want the outcome. It's the IEO model, right? So I thought, oh, great, this is easy. Now I've got it. 3 data points, all I got to do is go get these data points. That's when the complexity of measuring and understanding which variables matter started to flood in. And by the end of the day, I was, in my head, writing a letter of apology to Sandy Aston for having underestimated the power of this model. So here's how I present this to administrators, and I hope you can take this as something of value as well. So basically, we start with the inputs. Right? As your graduate students arrive here, having had an undergraduate experience, right, that has shaped them in many ways, to not fully understand what they bring in the door would be a real mistake. And that, first of all, you've got to know to what degree they already have what you want them to have at the end. Right? Otherwise, you could waste their time and your resources teaching what they already knew. Right? If you want to move people as far as we can, then we've got to know where they start. Now, all through this presentation, what you're going to hear is how Randy Swing got it wrong for 20 years, because I made more mistakes in assessment along the way than I'm proud of. As the new director of the Advising Center at Appalachian State, I refuse to put in the file folders high school records, because in college, everybody gets to start new, right? It's a blank slate. I don't care who your family was. I don't care what you did. I mean, doesn't that have some, I mean, it just kind of feels good that we admitted you, it's a blank slate, let's get going. Now think about that with me, you know, with my years away from this. There were 12 years of records. Do you think people suddenly had a new vision of mathematical skills or writing skills or attendance? I mean, of course they did. They brought with them a background that could have been very useful to an academic advisor for figuring out how to help them, right? So this whole idea that our students are blank slates when they arrive, just stupid. I mean, and again, I really believed it at a time, because I wanted everybody to have equal treatment at the beginning. They're not equal when they come in. So in an assessment model, we've got to know where students are when they arrive. If you don't, then there's no way for you to later determine how much they've moved. One of the classic problems was brought up in the last presentation. I'm also an old TRIO program director. I started my career as an upper bound director, straight out of master's program. And that's a perfect example that unless you have input data on those students, then the fact that they had a higher SAT score later doesn't tell you they weren't already established or expected to have a higher score. In other words, it was a screening process, the volunteer effect. Did that actually account for the outcome? So you have to have that input measure if you want to understand the impact. And I know you were doing just a really quickie version of that, so I'm sure that that's in that model. But otherwise, you can really be misled. All right. Aston calls the E environments. And I'd like to suggest that experiences wouldn't be a bad word to use, or that there may be any number of other words. But in essence, this is what happens to a student once they enroll. So if input is everything they bring in the door, environment is everything that happens after that. Now, I'm really focused on understanding academic environments. And the reason for that is that I think colleges and universities, I think faculty, do in fact bring something to bear that should change students. Now, isn't that a novel idea? That students are coming, they're spending time, they're paying money, that we should provide something that has value. Right? But yet, in higher education, in older models, it was all about how prestigious you brought the students in. Right? It was as though the campus didn't matter. Right? In fact, and I'll make a little fun here, but I'd love to work at Harvard. You know, what a great idea. You bring in brilliant students, and guess what? On graduation day, you have brilliant students. They're brilliant graduates, right? Regardless of what you did, right? And if you get to charge a lot of money for it, woo! I mean, this sounds like a business model I want in on, right? So I do believe that colleges and universities make an impact, and that the point of assessment is for you to learn how to shape this environment to the best effect possible. So tomorrow in the workshop, in fact, I'm going to expand on that a bit more. But just quickly, if all you're going to do is screen your admissions to bring in better and better students, then that does nothing for our diversity goals. And quite frankly, I just think it's wrong. I mean, if all you're doing is bringing in better and better students, then it doesn't matter what you do going home. Right? I'd rather you bring in the widest variety of students possible and then give them the kind of support and challenge so that you produce the outcome you really want. Right? That's my idea of education. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on environments. And I'm going to suggest to you that in data systems, this is the place we're the weakest. We tend to use dichotomous variables to collect information about our environments, right? I don't know what those would be for all of your programs, but in traditional undergraduate education, it'd be like, can you imagine that we do a check mark for athlete, yes, no. Right? Do you really think that the star athlete and the one who sits on the bench is having the same experience? Right? Of course not. There's got to be some variations. It is a continuum, not a dichotomous variable at all. For undergraduates, we talk about whether you take a class or not. Right? That's either yes or no. All right, so let me check with you. How many of you teach? How many of you are in a classroom? Yeah. Does every student who sits in your class have the same experience? Do they give the same to the class? Do they take the same away? Then can you see how silly it would be to do a yes-no check mark, right? If we're not willing to try to figure out more about what exactly happened, to record the differences. All right, I'm getting on my soapbox. Let me move on. And so outcomes. And this is the place that I've looked on your website, and I see that you've been working a lot on outcomes. Right? You've done a great deal of work in defining what a first-year student is, what it takes to become a second-year student, a third year, and a fourth year. I mean, these are your outcomes. So I think this is the place where you and most of higher education is getting it right the most, right? Trying to be clear about what you want to have happen. So anyway, let me just make sure I drive this home because I want to make sure that you get why I think this is such an important model. And so the way I want to do that is to look at the bad examples, right? So these are the mistakes people make when they put out an assessment plan. One is that they only measure outcomes. They have no input data and no environment data. Now, for a medical college, this is just a ripe error for you to fall into. And it's because you have the luxury of having licensure exams as your outcomes measure. Right? So the professional programs that have had licensure the longest actually were the first to really embrace assessment. they got into it early on because they had these standardized tests at the end. And that's why we see graduate schools, whether it's engineering, nursing certainly was one of the very first to be involved in this. Later, teacher ed and some of those kinds of colleges as well, to do comparisons of the pass rates of their graduates. Right? That's a pretty big deal for you, isn't it? Yeah. Do you know the pass rate of your grad? I can't imagine that you would be allowed on campus if you didn't. So good that you have that. But in the absence of knowing why some passed, what they brought with them, or what happened with them on the way, simply knowing the outcome measure of pass rate isn't enough. It's a really important thing, but it's not enough if you want to make changes. Am I boring you, or does this make sense to you? Right. So a real mistake is only measuring outcomes. Now, here's another one that I think is about to end. This is what I used to see a bunch of years ago when I'd go to a campus. I'd say, show me your assessment measures. And they would say, I don't know, 600 students take freshman seminar. Or here's the best one. I love this one. I was working with a library, and I asked them to show me their assessment measures. They had this really fancy dashboard that they put up that took the counter that was on the front door and automatically sent it to the website to show how many times the door had opened to the library. That's what they thought assessment was. Now, by the way, it was really fun because I looked at the data, which they never did. And all of a sudden, over the years, the number of door openings skyrocketed one fall. So I said, first of all, this is really silly. But because I'm a data guy, I gotta know, why did the door start opening more? Right? And they couldn't, they said they didn't know. Right? Well, so I was already scheduled to talk with students. So I just showed them the data, which is, I hope you're getting right now, this is a really good plan. When you get data, show it to students, ask the students to tell you what it means, because they figure it out, because they know, they live it. They are the data. So one of the students said, well, gosh, isn't that when they opened the new science building, which is on the other side of the library? So it turns out that the fastest way to get to the new science building is through the library. So what a wonderful thing. These folks managed to improve their assessment greatly by building a building out back. Right? That's what happens when you just count and you don't understand why you're counting or what matters. All right, now here's the one that'll get you. And that's where you start a new program, a new orientation for your medical students, a new study skills program, a new clinical experience, and you check and find out that more of the students who did that new program had the outcome you wanted in the end. But, especially if it was voluntary, you don't know, were only the good students the ones who volunteered? Right? What's the input? What would have been expected? So my favorite story is that as an assessment director, I was in my office one day, and one of the most excited student affairs people that I've ever known came in, and she was giggling. You know, she literally, I had to say, Joni, are you okay? Can you calm down? I can't understand you. She was so excited. And the excitement was that the university had just completed a study of a pilot program of a learning community. So they had recruited 60 students, new students, out of the 2,500 that they admit, the 60 students they had found. they've given them a one-semester-long learning community experience where they live together with classes together. And Joni was excited to tell me that the students in the learning community had 1/2 of a letter grade average higher than all other freshmen. They'd gone through the learning community and they had better grades. Right? They were volunteers. Now, I don't know if any of you know the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Do you know the personality traits stuff? Yeah, don't go spending time on this, but I'm a T. That's a thinking type. So logic, reasoning, more powerful than feeling for me, right? So data guy, truly. So my T hat came out, and I said to this poor, very excited woman, "So, Joni, how do you know that your program wouldn't have produced a whole letter grade higher if you had messed them up?" Right? Without input, I don't know if a half a letter grade was actually good news or bad news. Right? Well, Joni and I are still friends. She invites me over occasionally for wine, and so we have reconciled. But do you get how we can be really tricked that something I'm in love with happens to be associated with something I wanted to have happen, right? But I don't really have the evidence to link those two. A lot of that happens. All right, so then the last one, which is often done, and probably has some value. Right? You know where students started, you know where they end. Well, boy, that sure is better than not knowing where they started nor knowing where they end. But what do you do? How would you change something? How would you protect what was working? So if you don't know what they did between those 2 points, I'm arguing that you really don't have much to go on. All right, now I know I've exhausted you on the IEO model, but does this make sense? Is this something that you can kind of see how to hang other decision points around? All right, so, I'm an educator, so I need to get some feedback here. So there are 3 data points. What are those 3 data points? I, E, O. Oh, come on. Do it one more time. All together now. I, E, O. Perfect. All right. Even with English vowels. I love it. So, all right. Now there's a trick. Because I'm an IR guy, right? So I'm an institutional researcher. So all of a sudden, I've got to explain how benchmarking works. So in benchmarking, where you compare yourself to other medical schools, you don't have the inputs and the environmental data to be able to truly capture all that. Right? But benchmarking is IEO compliant because as long as you select peers that bring in students like your students, who go through programs like your programs, then it's fair to compare outcomes. Right? So you can benchmark because you're controlling for the I and the E. Right? Which means that you've got to be really good at picking your peers. Right? So you would not want to compare your outcomes to those from an elite or a lesser institution, or from a population that is really different than the population you serve, or from one that has longer time to degree or shorter time, right? So to the degree that you pick your peers, then you can look just at the outcomes and you still have an IEO model. So a little tricky piece of that. All right, so audience participation, little pop quiz. I hope you were ready. In the IEO model are grades I, E, or O. You may talk among yourselves. Anybody willing to venture, come forth and show where you're at on this? brave soul. Congratulations. So are they I, E, or O? They could be I, or they could be O. What do you think of that answer? Yeah, I think you have it exactly right. Can you tell me how or why? They have grades when they arrive. You could use those as input variables, right? That's true. And I'd throw in there that grades often become experiences, in that you end up in honors, or you end up getting certain kinds of experiences, like high grade students get to be tutors, or they get to be lab assistants. So it might even be that grades are an E. So do you get how the model works, even though what you have to do is to understand at the time that you set up your experiment, are grades I, E, or O? And in general, they can't be multiple, right? They're one or the other in a specific experiment. But if you want to understand grades, you probably want to treat them as I's, as E's, and as O's, right? In multiple experiments or data points. So, real simply, if somebody brings you an assessment plan, I would say to you, your job in reviewing it is to read the plan and ask, are the I or the input data there? Are measures of environment there? And are the outcomes there? And if you can't find those three data points, you have just discovered the hole in that assessment plan. And then it's an easy fix to plug that hole. All right, let me see if I drive this home one last time. Here's kind of the way I think of assessment now, and why that three-point process starts to get really difficult, is that in courses, you always start with the goals, and you've got to have the outcomes in mind, and that's a real beginning place. Once you know those outcomes, you can start to label the various prior experiences that might have an impact on those outcomes, right? That not everything students bring in the door are going to align with outcomes. So one piece of this is to start figuring out what's important about inputs, or you'll drive yourself crazy measuring everything and just get lost in the data. Then you start to fill in the E, the middle point here. And it's an endless array. Right? You look in the research literature to figure out some of the things that probably impact outcomes. So one is student engagement, right? It is kind of just common sense. Whether students are paying attention in the class or whether they're marking time in the class, that's an engagement. How many, and you're a relatively small program compared to many, so I don't know how many sections of any particular course there are. There certainly is more than one, but yet I'm suspecting most of your programs have a fairly small number of courses, right? So that means that there's a limited number of teachers involved, right? And perhaps more consistency than between those. But in some cases, faculty teach very different courses under the same number, right? And so you've got to know something about the actual delivery of the course if you want to understand what happened to students. In other words, enrollment in whatever, nursing 601, does not mean that everybody who got a check mark for that got the same experience. The course delivery structures, especially if there's multiple faculty involved or over multiple years, are very likely to change. And I will bet you that none of you have data that have tried to quantify or collect any information about the delivery of the content. And I don't know how you'd evaluate a course unless you knew something about how it was delivered. And then here's the one that I'll bet you have the least amount of data, and that is that you have students a few hours a week in classes. They spend a lot more of their lives outside of the class. So do you not think that what happens outside of the class has an impact on whether or not they achieve their outcomes? Right. And so I'll tell you that in looking at the research literature for medical schools and for graduate education, this is so thin. There is so little research on how out-of-class experiences impact graduate success that you're almost starting from scratch. So if anybody's looking for a research agenda and some publication opportunities, the field is wide open to understand this. In undergraduate education, we've done a lot more research. And for instance, here's some findings that I bet will just be shocking to you. Did you know that whether or not you had enough money to put gas in your car has a real impact on what your outcomes will be if you're a commuter student? Boy, isn't that an eye-opener? It turns out that whether or not you have child care that's dependable can have a huge impact on whether or not you graduate with a bachelor's degree. I suspect that's true with graduate education, but I don't know that. So anyway, I literally look at the world of outside class environments and start to figure out what you need to know if you want to explain outcomes. The first thing I'll hear when I present this model is, yes, but we don't control that. Folks, get over it. If you're willing to just write off elements of student failure without even trying, then get over it. Right? Just go work at JCPenney's or something, whatever. Just get over it. I want you to believe there is nothing that can stand in the way of student success that you're not willing to try to control. Now, would you go with me on that? Right. So go look at some of the undergraduate experiences. It turns out that one of the better experiments comes from the Community College of Denver. The Community College of Denver actually did figure out that the biggest reason students failed to earn an associate's degree was that they didn't have gas money for their car, and they didn't have dependable babysitting, and they didn't have enough food. Right? That they were spending time literally trying to figure out how to put food on the table for the family. So they decided in a really controversial program to convert some faculty salary monies to, in fact, raise the number of students in each class, increase class sizes, to hire people who worked as social workers, and started to work with students to align them with services in the community that could help them have the support they needed to be able to come to class. The success of those students, the program's called La Familia, it's well documented, just skyrocketed. And in fact, over 3 years, they managed to wipe away the differences in race in the success of students. And they wiped away the differences in gender and the success that students had. Right? Now, many faculty still were very unhappy that class sizes rose. It looked like they were putting more money in things other than faculty, right? But it turns out that if you follow the data, if you ask the students, they'll actually show you where the problems are. So it's an inspiration story. Okay, this is my idea of IEO, and here is the next problem for you. All those things interact. So do you begin to see the statistical, the mathematical, the research dilemma of starting to apply what looked so simple a little while ago of 3 data points? It turns out that whether you're engaged or not has a difference in what you do out of class. Right? There's all these linkages, and they all need to be understood to apply the model. All right, so let me really run ahead with just a couple of things that I want to hit for you. And that's about kind of 3 decades in the making and some kind of things that I hope will kind of shake you up just a little bit. Here's one, is that the goodwill of students is absolutely critical if you want to have a successful assessment program. What that means is that you've got to respect their time, you've got to share with them the results, and you've got to ask them things that they care about. You've got to make it worthwhile. So I really challenge you, anytime you decide you're going to do a new assessment that involves students, ask yourself some hard questions. Why should they participate? And if you can't get a good answer out of that, you probably have a problem. Some of you will know the book Good to Great. And let me just do one really fast piece out of that. And that's one of the ideas of Good to Great is something called momentum theory. And it basically says that good companies become great companies when they keep working at momentum, right? This is a potter's wheel, right? Once you get these things going, the momentum moves it and keeps it rolling. So finding the momentum points can be really tough. Here's what most educators think education looks like, right? That's your first, second, third, fourth, fifth, eighth year of graduate school, and your learning keeps going up, and it's a straight line. Anybody believe that model? Go look in your course catalog at all the prerequisites and the orders and the structures that you lay things out. You believe that. I'll tell you, you do. Here's how I think learning looks, right? That there are rises and there are falls, and it's messy, and there are decision points that are made. And that, in fact, sometimes getting confused is the only way to move ahead. Now, think about if you had to design an assessment program, how you would do it differently if you had those two views of education. In A, you measure at the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? But in B, if you measure at the wrong time, it looks like things aren't going very well, right? So it means multiple measurement points. And what if I actually got to where I could expect where the plateaus are going to be, so they didn't become shocking to me, right? All right, so here's your little test. Just go draw your own idea of what learning looks like in your discipline. Here's an exercise for a faculty meeting, is draw the directional arrows for learning. I bet that it would take, it would give you hours of great conversation. Is it, when do you start sloping up? How long is it before the slope comes up? When does learning happen? Is it all at the end? Is it do you get, could you envision a conversation that is nothing except some pretend lines drawn on a blackboard? All right, let me talk about nudge. And I know I'm running close here, so for nudge, this is a book that I'd encourage you to read. I usually ask audiences if they've read this, and almost no one has. Has anybody happened to read this? I'm not surprised. It's by a couple of economists. And so let me tell you that if you go get this book, I heard them on NPR. I'm an NPR junkie. So I heard them on the radio, and I literally stopped on my way to the office and bought the book. And I sat down to read it, and what I had to do was, every time they said economics, I had to mentally cross it out and put education in. And when they said consumers or customers, I crossed it out and put students in. So it turns out that these two guys wrote a book about education. They just didn't know it. Right? They thought they wrote a book about economics. And it's all about how you get people to make choices. Right? Even choices that are good for them, people will often not make. And what they suggest is that there are ways to nudge people to make the right choice. I love this book, but I'll tell you, if you go pick it up and start to read it, you're going to think I'm bonkers, unless you have that mental capacity to read this differently than the way it was written. So here's an example of a nudge. Right? A door handle like that means that you do what? Right? That's a nudge, right? It's beautifully designed. All right, what do? here is a real picture from a college campus that I took. Okay. That's how we do education. Now, I don't know about for graduate students, because I think you're more structured, but at least for undergraduates, isn't this exactly the metaphor for undergraduate education? We bring them in the door, we give them 47,000 choices, and let them figure out how to pull or push. And we don't give them any clear signs that it matters which way you do. Right? So I'd encourage you to think more about giving real signs for what is success. What's a successful path? And I think you know those. Let me skip this one and I'll work on it tomorrow. I want to make sure that I talk a minute about the book Switch. Now this is a book, I suspect some of you have read this one. It's been more popular. Anybody willing to admit this? All right, well this is one to go get. It's a couple hours, a quick, easy weekend read. It's entitled How to Change Things When Change is Hard. So is changing higher education hard? Yeah. There's a lot of things that are hard to change. But it turns out that there's a number of ways to get at this successfully. So let me tell you briefly just one of the stories from this book. And it's a review of what happened when several philanthropies in America decided right after the Vietnam War that we should go back into Vietnam and do something about some of the dilemmas that we left behind. So one of the problems was low-weight babies, low-weight children, and the death rate of children in Vietnam. So the various medical associations and others were able to ascertain from the research literature exactly what the problem was. The problem was that the water quality was bad, that there was poor sanitation in preparing foods, and that there was an inadequate food supply. So various groups built water treatment plants, came up with better varieties of rice to plant that were more nutritious, right, and tried to teach people better sanitation. They built canning, community canning and community cooking kitchens. None of that worked. But the literature was really clear, and it wasn't hard to go in and read and look. The water was lousy, right? There wasn't enough food. So why is fixing these things not working? One organization had a different idea. And so the way they dealt with this is that they went into communities and they found healthy weight children. And they interviewed the parents of healthy weight babies to find out what they were doing that others didn't do. That's called looking for the bright spots, right? Turns out that for some reason there were some people who had figured out that mixing in the leaves from sweet potato vines into rice and mixing in really tiny shrimp from the creeks and mushing that up to make a baby formula that had more than rice in it produced healthier weight babies. But this is not widely known practice in the country. Turns out that if your water is pretty lousy, as long as you're boiling it, you kind of handle it. Right? Food sanitation, not quite so terrible as long as you're boiling it and cooking it thoroughly first. Right? And an inadequate food supply, those sweet potato vines grow wild in Vietnam. And the creeks are full of little baby creek shrimp. So it wasn't about better harvesting, right? There were solutions at hand. And it was about simply using those. So what I'd like to suggest is that if your assessment program isn't hunting for bright spots, you're missing the point. So be very careful looking at the academic literature that says students must do X, Y, and Z. Well, I'll bet you'll find students who are doing just fine, and they're not X, Y, or Z. And I want you to know why. Look at those outliers. of the places assessment programs fail to capture data is understanding peer-to-peer relationships. Aston, again, had it right way back. I mean, he started writing about stuff in the 1960s when he started the survey. That the most powerful group on the campus are peers. Now, as a consultant, I learned real quickly that the right answer when I'm in front of a faculty group is that the most important group on campus are faculty, right? But it isn't so, right? The good news is I have my airplane ticket, so I can get out of here, so I can tell you the truth now and run. The most important influence on your students are other students. And until you figure that out, you'll never crack the student success nut. So what I want faculty to do is to learn how to manage student-to-student relationships. And if you can manage those in the classroom and out of the classroom, you have a powerful force that you could unleash on students. So what do you know about peer-to-peer relationships? Do you even ask students if they have friends, if they have study groups, or whether their interactions are with each other? So there's the piece of that. All right, let me switch. Let me flip past this really quickly and get to my final challenge, and I'll bring it to a close then. And that's, I would like to suggest to you that the assessment field has been around for 30 years now. And in spite of that, we're still struggling to make assessment really count. Right? Most assessments end up being empty reports on bookshelves. They just don't produce the change we'd like to see them produce. And I want to do a challenge to you, and that is to ask, what could medical educators bring to the assessment table that's not already there? I mean, great, you go read the books. You know, I've written some of those, others have. Go read the IEO model, go look at the stuff that says, here's how to do it. But what I want is for you to ask, what do you know as medical educators that could be applied to the field of assessment that might change the way historians or mathematicians or whoever else does assessment? And I'll get in real trouble if I go too far down this road. But I'll just suggest to you really quickly that there are some things that I think are just obvious, right? Like you do clinicals, right? You work in messy conditions, right? It's not always laboratory experiments, and yet you have to make sense of the finding. That sounds like assessment to me, right? You have to deal with patient compliance, right? But yet, what I see in many assessments is this yes/no checkbox, right? That, I mean, I'm presuming at least that writing a prescription is not what you're testing, right? You're testing whether or not the drug used had an impact, which means you got to know, did they use it according to the label, right? I mean, so you have a lot of experience in trying to understand compliance and understand how to put that into a research model. I don't see that stuff out in the assessment world these days. So I think you have skills that I'm challenging you to write a book, right? What do medical educators know that could be applied to assessment to change the way we do assessment? And I'm dead serious about that. I really think that's the future. So I'll end with, at least one little joke here. So the second option feels right. Let's go with that, said the boss. Should we always ignore what the data says, or is this more of a one-time thing? It's called intuition. Yeah, that's a slippery slope to witchcraft. And I'm afraid that's the way we manage many higher education institutions. So thank you for your attention.
Y agradecemos al doctor su presentación y entonces ahora estará con usted la doctora Milka Ríos y el doctor Rubén García para entregar los reconocimientos correspondientes. Aprovecho para recordarles que el almuerzo va a estar disponible aquí en la sala, aquí en el primer piso donde fue el registro.
Dr. Swing and Dr. Martino, please join us because we would like to present a certificate for your standing presentation in this morning.
University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences Campus, Title V Project, present this certificate to Kay Imordino, PhD, for her outstanding participation as keynote speaker at the Title V Second Annual Simposio, dated this 9th day of May 2013. Thank you. University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences Campus, Title V Project, present this certificate to Randy Swing, PhD, for his outstanding participation as keynote speaker at the Title V Second Annual Symposium, dated this 9th days of May 2013. Signed, Ilka Rios, Dean of Academic Affairs, and Rubén García, Director of UPRMSC Title V Project.
Le recordamos que el taller de la doctora Imordino después del almuerzo en el 316 de OID y la presentación especial de las iPads es aquí mismo en el anfiteatro de